Okay, so we're moving to a brand new unit now. Unit 7, we're talking about prosperity, and then we're talking about depression. So the two like opposite ends of the spectrum here. Extraordinarily sort of money-making times for the U.S. and also one of the lowest points in U.S. history. So the first lecture today is going to be on arts, literature, and the roaring 20s. So this time in the 1920s where the U.S. is really booming, a lot of things are going on, a lot of things are changing as well. And there's also this theme of sort of clash with the old ways of thinking and then this like new ideas. So just think for this time in the 20s about conflict between old ideas and new. So first lecture of this unit, we're going to go 1 through 4 and 8 through 16. So we're hitting a lot of questions today. So the first thing, so new art in mainstream America after World War I. So we're talking about question number 1 here, the lost generation. So it says, what was the nickname of a group of American writers who spent a lot of time in Europe and became disillusioned with American culture? This is the lost generation. That is the answer to that one. They're talking about confusion here. A lot of these guys some of them were World War I vets, and they came back. They weren't really fitting into this new American society. They were like, what did we really fight for over here? Was there really any change? And there was all this senseless brutality, all these deaths in World War I, and then you come back and then you just don't really see any difference. Doesn't seem to be a significant change from before the war to after. In fact, it's almost like nothing changed the entire time. So this is sort of feeling of not fitting in, like their experiences don't really mesh with what the government's doing, what people are thinking, their ideals. So what they were targeting, these writers, were the ideas of morality. So what's right and wrong? They're sort of challenging those old ways of thinking and sort of adding their own spin on it, what they think maybe the new ideas of right and wrong. The role of women, sexuality, and rigid social ideals. So they're really challenging sort of the framework of what people think. It's like I said, right and wrong, the like common things that people say are like acceptable. So they're challenging these ideas. And some of the authors here that you may have heard of, Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, T.S. Eliot came from this era, and also F. Scott Fitzgerald. So moving on, there's also a huge sort of renaissance of African American culture, especially in mainstream America. So we have Harlem Renaissance. So for number 3, so what this was a cultural movement. It was centered in Harlem, so in New York. That was sort of like its epicenter. That's where it all sort of resonated from. And it's also, you might also see it called the New Negro Movement. That's another name it was given. That was more what it was referred to in that time. And it was all about developing sort of African American intellect and art. And if they did this and sort of put it in mainstream America, it would sort of help stop discrimination, stereotypes, things like that. So sort of throwing themselves into mainstream America, that they have these sort of skills, they have this intellect that is valued, that is appreciated in America. So trying to sort of make their case on the national stage. And some people think it was the foundation for the civil rights movement. So setting the stage for a new movement that's really pushing for more political equality, social equality. And then we're moving on to poetry. So going back to number 2. So what themes did Langston Hughes address in his poetry? Well, first off, he's known for jazz poetry. So sort of putting his words to music and sort of making it more, it's easier to listen to for a lot of people since it's set to music, and it was really sort of trying to capture people's attention. And his main themes were African American segregation and discrimination. So bringing out these issues that African Americans are facing at this time. Very popular artist as well. And we're also moving to music. So usually when you think Harlem Renaissance, you think music. And these are two of the guys they're really associated with. So that's Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. Those are two of the main sort of leaders of this new music movement of jazz. So for number 4, what type of music? So it's jazz. And some other things you may need to know for this one as well. So it's all about improvisation. So sort of you have like the baseline things that you want to do, but then you also have sort of the ability to improvise, add things where you think they're needed to sort of keep going when you think it needs to be kept going, or cut it off early. You see more what they call scatting, so not really saying any specific word, just more the sounds that are meant to sort of capture people. So you'll hear them, just a lot of sort of random, it sounds like random sounds, but it's very pleasing sounding, it goes with the music, that kind of things, but they're not actually saying word, like English or like real words. And then also the thing to remember here is it's all about sort of volume, so it's loud and it's emotional. So it's trying to get your emotions going, trying to really sort of get you going. Now we're going to talk about the Roaring Twenties. So we're going to hit number 8. So this is where we're starting with number 8. So why was it called the Roaring Twenties? So mainly this was a huge social and political time of upheaval. So there's a lot of changes going on here. And for the first time ever, more people are living in cities than on farms. So it's a shift in population. And why it's called the Roaring Twenties is the nation's total wealth doubled in this time. So it's very economic. There's a lot of economic prosperity during this time. So this is also where you see the U.S. become a consumer society. So a lot of buyers really trying to market to that audience, really trying to buy things to sort of be a part of mainstream society. You have chain stores emerge here. Everyone's starting to listen to the same music. The same dances are seen all across the country, similar slang. And it's just sort of a time where America's becoming more one, but it's also becoming sort of not as regionally different. So you used to have a lot more differences between regions in the country. Like there were different dances, there were different types of music people like. But now it's sort of spreading across the nation. And you see at this time, this is a continuous theme throughout this entire a unit of clash, of conflict between the old way of life and the new sort of things that are going on in America at this time. So during the Roaring Twenties, we have Prohibition. So we're talking about number 10 here. 18th Amendment had been passed. So what were some of the consequences? So a lot of businesses were hurt. That's one of the main things because restaurants now can't sell alcohol, that kind of thing. The government was actually hurt because they lost tax revenues. If they completely outlaw alcohol, they cannot tax alcohol. So they lose a lot of revenue from that. You have the emergence of moonshiners who sometimes peddle deadly alcohol. If it's not made correctly, it can be lethal. And you have the emergence of organized crime. So a lot of sort of the mob ideas are coming here because they're the ones sort of pushing a lot of this alcohol and really sort of getting bigger at this time. And you also see, so for number 9 here, speakeasies emerge. So this is a sort of a location, a bar, a restaurant that you're not the casual person walking by would know about, but it illegally sells alcohol during Prohibition. Why they call them speakeasy is because you were supposed to speak quietly about such places so they didn't get found out, so they didn't get busted. A lot of them were associated with organized crime, so that's sort of how organized crime got people to come in, spend money. That's how they sort of started making a great deal of money to fund their other interests. And this is where you also see the emergence of flappers, women wearing shorter dresses, shorter hair, and you also see men starting to wear fedoras, the 3-piece suits, the long tails on the suits as well. This is where that sort of fashion idea comes from as well in these speakeasies. Now we're talking about technology and urbanization. So we talked about sort of the business aspect of it. So now what is technology and urbanization doing? So for number 11, so how did the improvements in technology and urbanization affect life in the 1920s? Well, first, so one of the big things is electricity lights the nation. So electricity is sort of spreading the country at this time. More people have access to it, so people are able to stay up longer. They're able to they have something to do because they have electricity. When it gets dark, it's not just dark anymore. That's one thing. So you have automobiles, so you have the ability to go places farther away. You have the ability to get places that you want to go more easily. And the one main thing to remember here is also community control. So as more people are moving to the cities, they used to live in small towns, small areas where there's a lot more community control. So you probably know about this. If you live in a small area, a lot of people know your business. A lot of people know what's going on, and sort of there's talk all the time. So it sort of keeps you in line because you know people will find out. Well, now a lot of people, since they're moving to these big cities, there's not that community control anymore. There's not those people watching you all the time. So it's a degree of freedom, but it also sort of lets them sort of express themselves in the way they want to without the fear of the community sort of backlashing against them. And this leads to a lot of culture shock. So like we were talking about, conflict with the old way of life, conflict with the new way of life, sort of coming together and causing a lot of sort of frustration between each sides. And like we were talking about here, so for number 14, so you're going to flip over to the next page, the American woman. So how did the image of the American woman change during the 1920s? The thing to remember here are the flappers. So we go from the flappers, which are sort of, like I mentioned earlier, shorter hair, shorter dresses, more makeup, things like that. So more modern idea of a woman versus the old sort of Victorian woman. So the dresses down to the on the arms, down to the wrists, down to the ankles. So it's sort of this conflict between the new styles, new ways of thinking for women, and the old ways of thinking. And you also have at this time Margaret Sanger and birth control entering sort of U.S. Public knowledge. So the idea of birth control is emerging at this time. And once again, just like we talk about every time, we have a culture clash. The old ways of thinking versus the new ways of thinking. And then 1920s life in America. So nativism. We've already talked about this a little bit. We're going to hit it again. So nativism is the sort of the disdain or this dislike for immigrants, sort of keeping with, we want just Americans here, we just want to be around Americans. So at this time there's limited immigration and there's isolationism. So we don't deal with other countries as much during this time. It's a return to the old ideals of the previous times in America. And this is where we set quotas on how many people are coming from other countries. There's also something else going on here. We have the Scopes trial. So for number 13 here, so this was the first highly publicized teaching of evolution trial. So it was a guy was taken to court over teaching evolution in Tennessee. It was called the Monkey Trial. So it's basically the conflict between fundamentalism, so teaching what is in the Bible, what is said in there, versus new scientific thought at this time, evolution, the idea of maybe it wasn't purely based on the Bible at this time. So we have another culture clash. The guy who was teaching evolution was fined like $100, so he was convicted, and it sort of set the precedent for the teaching of evolution was not okay at this time. But once again, clash between traditional values and that fundamentalism and the new sort of era and the beliefs there. So then we also have with African Americans at this time, black nationalism. So this was sort of headed on by Marcus Garvey. So for number 15, so his idea was black nationalism, and the way sort of the best course of action for African Americans was to go back to Africa. So he was really famous for the Back to Africa movement. He was an African American man, but his thoughts were they should be proud of their heritage and return. So he started this thing called the Black Star Line, which was an attempt for like transportation back to Africa. So he felt like we weren't the African Americans were not fitting in America. It's sort of a lost cause, and the best thing to do is return to Africa and sort of return to their roots. And then the final thing for today is the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. So these are the pictures to the right here. This is like one of my favorite things sort of to study because it's really, really interesting. So what happened was these two Italian men were arrested for murder. They were accused of killing the shoe factory like paymaster and his guard, and it really sort of captivated the nation and really showed that nativism was still like thriving in the U.S. at this time. So really prejudiced against immigrants. So what happened in the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, where they were sort of known as anarchists. So they were associated with some leaders of groups that were anarchists who believed to be a threat to the U.S. But they were law-abiding citizens. They had those beliefs. They sort of identified with those ideologies, but they were not carrying out anything in the U.S. They were law-abiding citizens. So they had little to no evidence against these guys, very shaky. And they also had, Sacco and Vanzetti had 16 fellow Italians come and testify to their whereabouts, basically saying they weren't there, they didn't do it. Problem was, they were convicted anyways, and they were convicted on things like one witness said they could only describe the killer as a foreigner with a mustache. So that was one of the main reasons they were convicted, because one of these guys had a mustache. Another guy even said he knew it was an Italian man who did it because they ran funny. So as he said, he saw the person who killed the guard, and he knew it was an Italian because they ran funny. So that was the basis for a conviction. And they were convicted, they were sentenced to death, and were executed. But something to remember here, you see a clear bias against foreigners, and that nativism trend is really going in America at this time. So this is really sort of the sort of court case to point to as, wow, America was really biased at this time against foreigners, really returning to that nativist sort of vibe, that nativist feeling in the U.S. against foreigners. And that is all for today.